And we are live. Sound check. Awesome. So, hello everybody. Welcome to the channel. I'm Moff from Memories of the Future. Today we have another guest, and say it will be an interesting conversation because we will be discussing whether the USA needs a new communist party. And the person which will join us to answer this question is Scott Battison from People's Revolutionary Party. With that being said, let's welcome Scott in.
Thank you.
Hello,
Thank you for
hello
having me.
there.
Hello.
Oh, of course. Well, please introduce yourself.
So my name is Scott Battison. I am the General Secretary of the People's Revolutionary Party. We're a Marxist-Leninist pre-party formation. We started in March of this year, and we launched publicly in May Day. It's May 1st. And we are currently operating as a pre-party formation, trying to organize towards our Congress, our first Congress.
Okay, that sounds very, very important. All those things sounds like very important. But if you will meet with on the street with your average John, Jane, or whatever other cliche citizen, uh, two jobs, kids, wife, house, rent, bills, insecurities associated with healthcare
Yeah,
and stuff. Uh,
yeah, absolutely.
w-
So
w-
I'm currently living with my girlfriend in Vermont. We're both working class people. She's a teacher. She actually works with the teachers union, and um, I'm currently unemployed. The previous job I had was I worked as a line cook for Sodexo at a university, and in terms of we rent an apartment. We don't live in a house. It's like most people. But things are actually been pretty good recently because we are actually able to afford a replacement car. So that was actually pretty nice.
Oh, okay. And for the average Joe and Jane, and if you meet them on the street, why should they care about another communist party, a new communist party, considering that there are others, but they have problems, they have issues. So, and you are talking about the Congress and stuff like that. So,
Right.
how do you
Yeah.
connect
So,
the two?
well, yeah, I would tell them that in terms of a communist party, one of the biggest reasons they should join the People's Revolutionary Party over another party is that we actually have experience in some of those other communist parties. Just about everybody who is an organizer was a leader in one of the other parties at some point, and they're drawing upon that experience to try to fix a lot of the problems, the systematic issues, the institutional problems, the social inequities of those other parties. So I would say we don't necessarily need another communist party. We just need a functioning communist party. And in the United States, at the imperial core, organizing the workers is extremely important at that level.
Okay, I like how the functional part that you've mentioned there, you specifically said the functional party, because lots of people get very enthusiastic about starting another organization, but they almost, because they start from the premise, and usually it's a pretty good conclusion or a premise. Hey, that party is bad, and or that party doesn't do anything and meaningful, which means that it's bad. Let's do something better. But there aren't things, specific things they can measure and trace and say, hey, we will be better because A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Because measuring stuff always allows you to improve. So they just want to start another organization. And the fact that you mentioned functional, it's a good sign that you might have the know-how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we measure functional. We're a scientific. We believe in scientific socialism. So to us, measurable is the most important quality there. Um, Tangibly, we've actually gotten a lot done. We put together a provisional constitution, a program. We've gotten together technical manuals about how the party is supposed to operate. We've actually started contacting several workers to try to help them organize a union. We've done a lot of different things, and we're actually active in 5 different states right now: Vermont, Texas, Tennessee, Michigan, and Indiana. I believe that's 5. And we're looking to start what we call organizational committees because we're a pre-party formation. We need to lay the foundation. So we're not trying to necessarily declare that everything's set up right away. We're just trying to establish cells and interact with the workers as best we can to try to build a foundation for a successful party.
Okay, and these are very nice points, and we will get into them a bit later. But let's say a new person full of enthusiasm joins your organization and decides that is, I don't know, not running, is not efficiently running, or at least that person has the impression that it can make the organization even more efficient. How easy would it be for that person to get in and change things for the better?
So it depends on where they would join necessarily, only because of the work that comrades have already done. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to get behind. But I would say that in terms of actually joining, the process is fairly simple. They would they would go to our website, they would go to americancvu.net, they'd join, they'd send in an application, we'd set up 2 interviews to sort of figure out what kind of member they want to be, if they're going to be a party member or if they're going to be what we call a supporter, and sort of aid the logistics. In addition to that, they could also figure out where they were. If they were a comrade in a new state, for example, they'd actually attend central committee sessions and receive direction from there. But in terms of improvement, I mean, it follows democratic centralism. If there's a motion they want to propose, an idea they want to propose to the central committee and put forward to a vote, quite frankly, I've never seen a central committee better composed or professional in its attitude. So any reasonable idea has a pretty good shot of being passed. But it depends. New members tend to go through some set of education, so they at least understand how things are supposed to work and what's already been done. So there's not sort of this overwhelming overlap with what people are trying to do right away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course it makes sense. Well, I'm asking that because in a sort of ideal scenario, all the people joining an organizations will have the will to improve things and will have this ethos, hey, I can do better. And of course, they in that ideal scenario, we would also be informed about how to do it better. And of course, not all the people have that mindset and are at that stage, but if somebody is getting on board and saying, hey, I have the experience, I have the knowledge, and I know I have the vision, okay, you say they can fit, and with some checks and balances, they can very easily get up to speed and be put into whatever processes and projects and, to help the organization get better compared to a classical organization in which you have all these roadblocks and you can have all the great ideas you want. The chances of seeing them put properly into practice in a reasonable amount of time is slow to non-existent.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the biggest issues I had in the previous organization I was in, where the central committee, it was composed of members who were just the chairs of the local clubs. So you had to get elected to a chair position. And then, even then, the central committee only met 6 months. So every 6 months, it met twice a year. So really, it was A, a rubber stamp for everything the Politburo had done, but also B, it was impossible, really, to get any substantial business done within 2 hours. So that's a huge difference. Substantially more efficient, in my opinion, but also more democratic.
Yeah, and that's why I'm asking, because usually people will, if people are educated enough and they have some previous experience within whatever other organizations, they kind of have a feeling of this, and if they join a group of people trying to achieve stuff and there aren't certain, I don't know, mechanics and instruments available, and the process doesn't seem fast enough and properly streamlined, they will say like, yeah, okay, it's nice, but I have better things to do in whatever other projects and stuff like that, and you'll lose possible very great members.
Yeah, and on top of that, I mean, people have different interests. Not everyone who's local wants to operate only at the local level, which is why we have, I mean, for the sake of efficiency, we have departments that handle different sections of party work. And just recently, because of all the union activity we've been running into, we started a labor commission. And both the departments and the commissions are national, so anyone can join in, but they can only join one commission or one department at a time, and it's just to prevent people from being overworked, overstretched, and burned out, which I've also seen a lot of.
Yeah, and this could tie very well with the next aspect a capable person would be aware of. If a group of people decides to collude and sort of take power, become the said roadblock in the organization, just because they can, or due to pure spite, ideological differences, how easy would it be for you and your organization to handle such a problem within the cadre, within the membership?
Right. So first and foremost, it's important to remember that factionalism is in our bylaws an offense that can lead to expulsion from a party. So we don't support the concept of line struggle inside of a party. It's not tolerated. But in a theoretical aspect, what would happen is, let's just say it was a typical Democratic minority for a debate. Well, if they wanted to push an idea or an item and they were all fairly new, first and foremost, and they were coordinated internally, the way we have our communications set up, it's pretty limited that people can just create sort of new chat rooms and wherever they want without party consent using party resources. So we at least have an organized say in how debate is structured, but that's democratic centralism. If they kept pushing a particular line or item aside from disciplinary measures, it would just get voted on and voted down. We don't have a veto system, but it would have to be pretty compelling for the majority of people not to recognize they were pushing a line struggle. Like I said, we have an educational system that's training comrades to recognize these differences. The individual institution is fairly young, so it's fairly open to ideas. And so whenever there's a particular controversy, usually the members participating are pretty well disciplined about it. There's no, it doesn't really leave the room sort of thing. It doesn't become a larger issue. But theoretically, if there were such an issue, it would largely be managed by the communication systems that we have, limiting how that debate would be shaped, but how that line struggle will be shaped in particular, and then a disciplinary action if the members engaged in factionalism.
As that sort of ties in with how well one organization is managing its human resources. It sounds very human resources. It manages the potential of its members. As there are members who might be extremely enthusiastic and they would like to join something, and not necessarily from a perspective of ill intent or trying to do harm, but they just get with the flow. And then, as you as a leader, as a leadership, the leadership needs to take action and to properly understand to help the people with potential remain within the organization and get rid of the troublemaker, and that is something that needs to be done fast and properly without creating more problems.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the biggest issues we had in some of the previous organizations some of the members were from, is the disciplinary analysis was sort of ad hoc and superficial. Every problem was brought back to the general secretary, and they formed an ad hoc committee to deal with the issue, which meant no records were kept. The charges were sort of inconsistent, and so was the punishment, which is why we focused on building up bylaws that made sense and was coherent, and that everyone had a chance to alter or contribute to, because we wanted the disciplinary process to be clear and fair, but we also wanted it to be thoroughly enforced. So we have designated officers that investigate such things at different levels, and we made sure that none of those individual officers can conduct an investigation with a conflict of interest.
Oh, that's actually sounds very, very good, because there are plenty of organizations, both offline and online, and we can see how groups of people derail or block the majority of their actions and projects, and then a faction splits because it, for good reason, they can see and say, hey, that is stupid and we don't need that. But then if you have one organization and then that a group of active people leaves and then another group of people leaves, that group of people becomes ever smaller and nobody will gonna achieve anything. So it's not a pleasant topic, but it needs to be brought up and specifically handled, because otherwise people just leave because things aren't done in a proper way and fashion.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's something we're very cognizant of. I mean, the leadership does whatever it can to be transparent to its members and its reporting. We operate under operational planning to make sure there is proper measured objectives, but also so that there are assessments and reports that are filed back with the central committee. But on the flip side, when it comes to disputes and factionalism, I've personally found that if people just find the process fair, then even if the decision is at times heavy-handed, they will be more accepting of it. They'll be more likely to stay and continue to engage because everyone knows what the process is, everyone knows what the rules are, and it's a general sense of fairness, which in general is lacking from most capitalist institutions.
Oh, definitely. The examples in this area are endless. But let's connect it with the next topic. You spoke earlier about the fact that some people might not be in your direct reach or in your area and you want to expand. If someone wants to start an organization, what uh, sort of help, a starter pack, can you provide a starter pack in order to help that person or group to start faster and without some of the mistakes you?
Right. As an institution, it's extremely important that you understand what it is you're trying to build. One of the things I found that anarchist institutions always get wrong is the sense of permanence. They don't want anything to be able to be permanent and last forever. It's one of the fundamental issues because they don't ask questions like, well, how do you hold things accountable over long periods of time if something proves to be effective? Because they design their collectives based around a certain project. When you're designing an institution, specifically a proletarian institution, you have to design it with a sense of permanence. And you have to design it thinking you will not be the first or the last person necessarily to be in office. So it's important to understand that. It's important to understand you have to think about the uncomfortable bits first, logistics, funding, communications, security, even things like how long is it going to take to actually edit literature, designated roles, terms of office, the really boring things. And I've actually seen quite a few charters and constitutions from different institutions that take the ideological and try to insist on mentioning it in documents that are supposed to be about process. No one's going to doubt you have values if you find ways to make them work. And no one's going to doubt you have values if you put them in the proper place and at the proper time instead of in documents and plans that are supposed to be about process and operations.
Okay. But still, do you have a set of such documents that if another person comes say, hey, this
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
a template for, I don't know, constitution, this is a template of operations, this is a template of organizational structure, and
Right.
maybe some period of time.
So a good example, not necessarily a template, but a good example that we followed was actually the Soviet Party constitution. It talked about process and how things were supposed to be structured. On our website, we have our provisional constitution, which is structured around the idea that we need to have a Congress within the first 2 years. And that's sort of the standard we try to set institutionally. And you can see it in the document. It's everything's there in terms of these are standards. This is what we're trying to meet. These are terms of office that seem reasonable. These are the way things are supposed to go. These are the officers that are going to be managing certain things. That's a pretty solid template for a few reasons. But if you are starting from scratch and you're not trying to start a party, it's actually important to think about bylaws. I've noticed that a lot of organizations don't tend to take bylaws very seriously. And for our bylaws, we actually use the model of what's common in the United States, which is by title, and then by section, and then by clause. And we used a decimal system to sort of describe everything and what chapter was what. And we just went into the nitty gritty of the duties, how things are supposed to go. Trying to write a bylaws like that often, helps everyone get sorted in their head about, what is malleable, what can be changed, how things should be changed. But you need to figure out what you're trying to do first. And that, I think, is very hard for people because they get started with a project and they pursue it passionately, and they don't expect it to go anywhere, but then it does. And you have to try to figure out, okay, what is it exactly I'm trying to do? Am I trying to set up an electoral front? Am I trying to get people to participate in agitprop? Am I trying to educate and raise class consciousness? You have to ask yourself what it is specifically you're trying to do. And different kinds of rules and templates will be applicable based on what it is you're exactly trying to do.
Sure, but let's say me being on the opposite end, I'm sort of faced with almost endless possibilities, and when you have too many possibilities, you get you stop because it's not clear to you which of those possibilities with which you should start. So that's why I'm asking, do you have sort of a PDF? Hey, this is your area. These are the problems that you might encounter. These are the possible actions. And this is the time, these are the resources in, I don't know, people, pamphlets, printers, websites you need in order to have this degree of efficiency. If you want to get to the next degree of efficiency, you need, instead of 1 people, you need 10, and then this is what you can achieve with 100. Because if I would have that kind of stuff, like 3/4, I believe, of the questions I might have would receive an answer during 1 or 2 days of lecture and some thinking instead of endlessly postponing. Yeah, I could start with this. Oh, but that would be interesting. But then life happens and another event gets in, and oh, that would be also interesting. But the event passes and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, necessarily that doesn't exist yet. That's sort of one of the biggest issues with founding a proletarian institution is how little you have contemporaneous information to work off of. But I would say that if you wanted a universal task list, I would start by saying, you know, you can start today with a spreadsheet, right? You can say who do I know is reliable and in organizing, and who do I know that would be able, who would also be interested. Start there. Start with what's called an affinity circle, and try to mobilize support. Because if you have people working with you, it'll be less burdensome to everybody.
Yeah, definitely. Would you be would it be interesting to you to uh, allocate some resources to draft such a document? We don't have to make it the perfect document, but it can be sort of a public document and everybody can get in and put their ideas in and have sort of a template. Hey, dear comrade, if you want to start something in your area, these are the options, these are the resources you need. If you are looking for someone to manage a specific stuff, they should know A, B, C, D, maybe preferably have some experience or not. This is how you handle if they don't have experience. The amount of time they should have available should allocate during a week or stuff like that. And no.
Yeah.
Scott, are you there?
Yeah. Sorry. An owl sneezed. The signal got interrupted. Anyway, so I would just say that the easiest thing to get started, yeah, I would say we were definitely interested in creating those documents. It's going to be a while before we're able to do that, just because of how much we have going on. But if you were to do this, if you were to write this document, I would say the necessary task list has to include assembling a team. It has to include operational planning. We've created a template called the Direct Action Plan, which it has basically the entire process of how to prepare to do a thing, the logistics, the manpower, the person power, whatever, what you're actually trying to achieve. If you're let's pick something easy like mutual aid. You have to consider who it is you're trying to reach, how long it's supposed to go on, how you're going to sustain that. You need to consider public outreach. So as you said, a website or social media. You need to figure out who your audience is. I mean, it's hard to do in the theoretical, but yes, we'd be interested in drafting as best a document as we could and helping people sort of get organized.
Because I believe this kind of distillation of information, if shared with enough people, it would save them like huge amounts of time and effort and letting them figure everything by themselves. Because I see the idea that, hey, if you struggle, you can learn from your experience, but that experience takes time, effort, and some people might never get those things. So a bit of help, some fingers pointing, hey, that's the right direction to start and go with. I believe would help a lot of people streamline their activities and ideas.
Well, absolutely. And that was actually the fundamental basis. That was the major benefit of having the Communist International, was that you could ask more experienced comrades, who struggled in a different country, hey, what worked, what didn't, what was your approach? How did you solve this problem? You could collectivize this. And in lieu of a functioning international, there's, I think, about a half dozen different international blocks at this point of communist or socialist parties. It's hard to find a reliable source as you've described. But yes, we'll be collectivizing ours as best we can. I think if we could create a set of field manuals, as we've already done, but with the intention of international dissemination, I think that would help pay forward the work we've already done to the other comrades in the struggle in other parts of the world. I would say the most reliable comrades I've run into are those with experience in campaigns. They understand sort of the logistics. I mean, we have to learn from the bourgeoisie the best we can. While there isn't normally a point in electoral campaigns, they actually are quite good at illustrating the intense logistics in political mobilization. Even just infiltrating a party office just to learn about the basics of administration, record keeping. If you're a union member, start going to your local union meetings, because quite frankly, they actually have most of the tactics that we use. Sorry about that. Like I said, it gets noisy randomly. But that's sort of the thing that you should start to do. Get involved with whatever civil institution you can.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because inside the party and during election times, there are lots of processes, lots of logistics, lots of people working with other people. That experience would be so much needed in any other type of organization outside of the already established parties. But people are just talking, they don't get to interact with that kind of organization, that kind of environment, and they simply have no idea. And I believe that's a great deficit, a great problem for any people trying to start an organization. But talking about goals, what goals do you have? Like, can you say how many members do you have? And if you have, when you have now this many members, what are you trying to achieve, and what's your next step?
Right. So the first set of goals that we had was that we said, okay, in terms of raw numbers, what kind of support do we think we need to host a Congress? And we basically agreed on two standards. That one, we either have 75 dues-paying members, or that we have 5 operational clubs. And for those of you who probably aren't aware, in our party, a club is a statewide organization, and the bar for having an operational one is that they host their first club conference and elect a slate of officers. And the reason we set that goal was twofold. First, we wanted diverse representation at our Congress, geographically as well as politically. And we wanted to make sure that we had basically the support base to be able to financially sponsor a Congress. There are other requirements we set. We required a plan of work to be prepared in advance of the Congress, to sort of be debated and ratified for the first 5 years of work. We required that a budget be drawn up, and we passed it actually this last month at the Central Committee. It was our last great achievement. We're currently working on a plan of work. We also required a bylaws, and we required a constitution and a party program. And we listed those as critical documents, as essential documents, because they're to the foundational operation of the party.
Yeah, absolutely. So what if you achieve, if and when you achieve these goals, and you say, hey, these goals are checked, what's your next step? What should you what you envision as being the next stage for your organization? Well, somebody's having internet issues, but up until that moment, we can have a little chat. So yeah, this is the type of discussion with someone who has a more than a bit of experience with organizations and people doing things, because otherwise you will always talk the talk about organizing, about building a structure, and you'll build the structure, you'll organize yourself. The problem is there are things, there is this reality, and in reality you need to connect with people, and you need to, how to put it, to go through certain stages of organizational development. And if you don't have previous experience, you'll encounter all those events, and you might not have the know-how slash experience to how to deal with those things, and that will cost you time. It will cost you uh, your mental sanity sometimes, and in the end it can even break the organization. So yeah, that's sort of a very problematic thing. It's nice to have enthusiasm, it's nice to have that naive enthusiasm. Yes, we can do things, we can achieve stuff, but you need somebody who not necessarily has that enthusiasm tempered because of his previous experience, because you don't want somebody on that the other extreme. And I've seen all the evil, nitty, shitty, gritty things that happened in my previous workplaces, in the previous organizations, and you can't do anything. You don't want to go to the other extreme of denialism and denying stuff. But you need someone who has the experience and preferably still has a sufficient amount of enthusiasm and will, preferably some goodwill. So it's an interesting mix to get your hands on, a mix of abilities and principles. Let's hope he's coming back soon, gets over the internet issues. So yeah, that's the thing, and this is very important for you if you want to start your organization, to realize very very fast, because you might have the enthusiasm, which is great. But that enthusiasm, solely the enthusiasm, gets you so far, and you need to get the people with experience in, and that's where you need to sort of develop. Either you develop and you learn by yourself, and you are this magical being who knows to do how to do everything. You know how to put the enthusiasm in people and get them energized. You know how to choose the people, to get them organized and put them at their proper tasks. But then we start talking about idealistic and alternate universes and stuff like that. In the real world, it's way easier to get a good team in which somebody handles the projects, of course, with a consensus from everybody, but directs the resources where they need to be directed. And like Scott said, you get a person who, or a couple of persons who can oversee what is happening, and there are no conflict of interests, so there are checks and balances. And that's how you do an organization which is a bit bigger than having just a charismatic leader and lots of yes men around him who will block everything else or will deny that wrongdoings are happening and things like that. If you really want to grow and do do something good for for your organization. Otherwise, yes, go and cosplay. I believe it's the word. Go and pretend that you have an organization. Consume your time fool the others and be in the same place, couple of years later with not much achieved. And if you like that kind of scenario, sure, by all means, go ahead. Oh yeah, and this is the the other aspect where the other aspects gets in, and the other aspect being you have your own organization, and like Scott said, you have an finite amount of time and the resources, be it money or people and so on, and they of course they have a finite amount of resources available. But you can and you should sort of build your organization and your modus operandi in such a way that you can connect with other organizations and take advantage of their experience. You don't have to solve everything by yourself. You don't need to create an entire structure to solve a problem. Maybe you just need to make enough space in your organization, like the open source kind of project we were talking previously. And that kind of project needs to be made available for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Well, we would disseminate it probably over social media. We would probably host it on our website. And I'm sorry for crashing like that.
it's okay. Welcome back.
I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, we would have to disseminate it over social media and host it on our website.
Yeah, exactly. And then is the moment when people simply can just get their experience and put one paragraph or more paragraph and say, hey, this is my experience. And you can get so much more done with limited resources or limited resource consumption and allocation from your part, and you just benefit because we are in the age of the internet. Let's use the experience from the crowd, not just the capitalists. Let the capitalists do the crowdsourcing and stuff like that. Let's use all those things to our advantage.
Absolutely. And to be frank, I think it's unfortunate that so many social media spaces that communists have built have devolved over the years. I think that while the academic portion of the debate of ideology is extremely important, the sheer lack of reliable resources. I mean, even the anarchists have managed to publish more in collective organizing than communists in recent years in a large part of the world, despite the internet. I think part of that is because they focus on flexibility, and so they're not particularly worried about how applicable one idea is over the other. It's less scientific; it's more of an amalgamation. And I feel like a central party like the People's Revolutionary Party could really sort of set up a scientific portion to its institution where it helps disseminate internationally and through media what tactics and what applications and what institutions or portions of the institution have really worked, as you suggested.
I guess, like we all have read the history, and we appreciate that Lenin started something, and then Stalin started something, and together with their collectives, their groups, their party members, they built something by them, sort of by themselves. But we are in 2020. Let's understand that in 2020, by themselves doesn't necessarily mean that me and you and only the two of us we can outsource or everything. We don't have the expertise and ask for help or and receive it, and that's like 2020, the idea of the year. Let's do in 2020, let's do things like we are in modern times now, not like in early 1900s or something.
I know, and it's I wrote an entire general guidance on technology in the party, and the reason I issued that guidance was because there were parties that people had been part of that were very technophobic. They didn't understand the potential for technology. They didn't understand how it could be used. They only understood its limitations, and even then, they were exaggerated and poorly framed because they didn't use it on a regular basis. Quite frankly, even though it's a little dated, email is extremely helpful. Just being able to communicate instantaneously, even at that pace, to be able to conclude all the details you need, and effectively had a word processor inside of a message. I mean, that's really powerful, and that's scratching the basic surface of what we have at our fingertips. Um, what we're doing right now, we have video chat and audio chat across great distances. We can communicate our existence through social media, even though comrades may have felt isolated. I think one of the biggest benefits of the internet is, even in very reactionary areas, being able to reach the one or two Marxist Leninists that are there and help them to be productive.
Yeah, exactly. And all these people who might say, "Hey, I would like to join, but I'm not willing to show my face or get involved into my area because there aren't enough comrades, people willing to start something." They can get online and they can get helping with whatever technical or ideas. And there are so many people with good hearts and smart that can come and contribute and improve things and make them faster and so on. But
Yeah.
you said the word phobia, and that clicked with another thing because um, previously, like a couple of decades ago, not too long ago, in the USA, there was the magic moment of the Red Scare. And there are, in the groups I've been in, online circles, I've read a lot about comments of people saying, hey, the Red Scare wasn't that long ago, A, and B, there is still infiltration going from the power that be from the Free Letters Agency. Do you encounter this kind of talk? How do you tackle the subject of, and is it a threat for you?
So to break this down, first of all, historically, that's accurate. The Red Scare is not that long ago. It's arguable that a new Red Scare has already begun. It started on September 11th, and it happened again. It resurged during the Occupy movements when the government was cracking down very hard on even just Occupy Wall Street. They were protesters who were just upset that they got fired en masse, and because of the abuses of the banking system, and the police were sent in, the federal agents were sent in to infiltrate. There were SWAT teams, repercussions for a decade, really. So that fear is real, but I think it's important to understand that among comrades, paranoia isn't healthy. It's not good to act with constant suspicion. You have to operate on the basis until you have valid proof that everyone here is being honest and constructive. There are sort of basic techniques you can do to sort of be wary about agencies, but in terms of long-term planning for that, it's one of the reasons we have a security department. We're only 35 members strong, and we don't suspect we have any infiltrators, but we know at some point in time that's going to be an issue. So we developed in our interviews some basic security questions, for example. I mean, there are some things you can do that are proactive, but really part of the whole system of checks and balances is to prevent infiltration from being overwhelming. Part of the reasons the Communist Party of the United States, the old CP, is so denigrated is because it was so heavily infiltrated and is too visible, right? You need to keep a balance on visibility and making sure you're not too easy to infiltrate. But there's only so much you can do without sacrificing connecting to the workers. That's just part of the issue. That's just part of the that's just part of politics. Um, but if I think about the actual threat level of the state towards our individual institution, it's pretty low. They just probably don't even know we exist. It's rare even then that if you're being monitored on social media, that you actually get tapped into. They have to be able to find a way to do that, and they have to figure out how you're meeting. So, I mean, meeting in person is okay, but there are actual applications that are reliably developed that you can use that are more secure, that have encryption. Um, you should take it seriously because the United States is a superpower, and it didn't maintain that position overnight, and it developed a whole apparatus to defeat specifically the Soviet Union. So, as a communist party, you have to be aware of that. But you also need to be cognizant of the fact that that's not an excuse to treat your comrades poorly and to act like a paranoid, uh, unsupportive comrade. I mean, it's a balancing act, but I think a healthy amount of skepticism towards your own internal systems and how secure they really are is one of the most productive approaches. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear that you are aware of it and you just developed some procedures and stuff and steps to kind of manage it and but not let it overrun and take over everything you want to know. Everything is red scare, everybody is infiltrating and
Yeah, that's not healthy. I mean, it's actually really amusing too, because if you're talking about the ordinary police officer, they're actually really bad at it. It was pretty comical. In some protests that I have attended, I mean, they all had the same military haircut, and so they're all about like around 30 or low 40s, and so they're almost predominantly male, and you can tell because they just walk differently. They have that straight edge, posture. They immediately try to figure out who the leaders are. I mean, it's so obvious in some jurisdictions that it's painful. Um, in fact, one of my friends regularly attends a convention where one of the games is spot the Fed, because they're always so routinely infiltrated that they're hackers. So they have this game where they try to find the Fed by hacking all the devices in the room, and then they send the messages like, "Hey Fed, what's up? How you doing?" Like it's really like the self awareness is what's healthy about this. The United States is disproportionately oppressive towards the left, um, but a racially diverse left is the most threatening to them. And so, certain strongholds for the left that have always been sort of reliable recruiting grounds, they're very heavily policed. They're very heavily monitored. Have you ever heard of a trap card of a trap? What are they called? A signal trap. That's what. Yeah, it's a device that monitors for phone signals in a given area, and it can latch onto one. Have you heard of
oh
that?
yeah, a sting. There is I know it by another name, but yeah, I
Yeah,
know what you're
yeah.
talking
I
about.
probably am just not using the correct name.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying that Michael is correct, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's they use them all the time. You can actually see them in most cities. You can see them on top of traffic lights, and you can see them in certain windowsills. It's extremely common. In some jurisdictions, they're barred from being purchased by anyone but the police. In some areas, it's ungovernable, so you can't, because there's so much technology around that it's just an underground trade. Places like L.A. And Seattle, Washington are like that. But I mean, it's everywhere. So you just have to assume that what you're doing is being relatively is potential to be found, and so the goal is to try to make whatever data you disseminate and create, that it's difficult for them either A, to find, or B, do anything about. Some social media platforms you can get shut down really quickly if you're an identified communist. I mean, it's there. It's there. You just have to be cognizant of it. And you have to be like, okay, do you develop bots and dummy accounts? Do you have party names where people's names are obscured on the official list so people can't actually look up their legal name? How much information do you keep in a central database? I mean, it goes on and on. You have to think about this seriously because, again, the security apparatus was designed to attack and defeat the Soviet Union.
Yeah, usually any state it's in the interest of any state/government to develop the ways and means to squash problems, regardless of the ideological orientation. That's the role of the government, to govern and to not let other people form enough of powerful point group in order to threat the existing powers and the existing situation. So, but
Yeah.
this topic of sorry, one second, of safety on the internet, this should be an entire episode and have some people talk about it, either from an organizational perspective, but also as a private citizen, in order to have some, at least some pointers about what and how should you act on the internet, and if you want to start actions and parties and stuff, what other things you should be aware of, at least. That could be an interesting topic of discussion.
Oh, absolutely, and it's permanently relevant. So I don't think that anyone would deny either the power of the internet or its threat. Even if you don't have an online persona per se, there's still data that is being actively collected. So just the basic security of personal integrity of your own data is something that is a 21st century problem. I don't think anyone has ever, really saw coming. You know what I mean? For the
Yeah,
from the 20th century.
yeah, definitely. But talking about the three letter alphabet agencies and the international things, international events. Um, in the last years, we saw various international incidents making it into in the media, and for a while, uh, everyone was either pro or anti-China in the matter of the Uyghur situation, and they were very vocal. But that died out. That outrage died out. Then it was they were pro against Palestinian Israel in the Palestinian Israeli conflict. Everybody was again outraged, but that got extinguished all by itself, and people simply moved to another topic. And now we get to the Afghanistan topic, which is hot, the Afghanistan retreat of the evil imperialist and the victory of the, how did they put it at the end of the Rambo movie in the credits? Also freedom fighters, I believe they were called. So how do you interact or stay away with this kind of cheap mercantile engagement with whatever international topic is hot?
Well, I mean, first of all, we actually discuss these topics internally pretty extensively. We have a press department which puts out party roundtables where party members are free to discuss contemporaneous subjects. Um, but in terms of Afghanistan, it presented a pretty unique instance because it wasn't just, how do you feel about what this other country is doing. It's, what did we do, and how do we react to what was done in our name as citizens of the United States. Um, and primarily, we chose to react by saying, good, the withdrawal was the removal of another neo colony, potential neo colony, and it was the removal of an occupation, an anti-democratic occupation in many ways, um, and a brutal humanitarian crisis, and in which war crimes were regularly committed, from bombing hospitals to violating rights of people to emigrate and immigrate. I mean, it goes on and on. The jailing, the unfair search and seizure of persons and property and personal effects. I mean, it really goes on and on. The callousness with which people were paid off after one of their innocent relatives was killed, with tens of millions of dollars. I mean, it really, it it's pretty baffling. I mean, the scale of the issue is such that it's going to take decades for people to really understand what did happen over there, and it happened over 20 years. It was not insignificant. It's not like these rumors, that were propagated about a Uyghur genocide in China, or the riots in Hong Kong. It's not a political dispute or a disputation of facts. It's just ignoring what happened. And I think one of the biggest issues we're going to face in the near future as Americans is to be able to explain the scale of empire. People understand that it's there, they understand that it's unethical, but they don't understand the scale of its problem. And I think as a communist party, that's one of our top responsibilities in terms of investigating these different contemporaneous events. Which ones are not only relevant but are being sort of shuffled away or swept under the rug as the empire sort of retreats during the next decade or so.
Okay, so you really you tackle each event and you get engaged with all those events on a more deeper level than, oh, this is what's hot today, and oh, we take this side. There is something more than this kind of cheap outrage that we see from all the sides and on the internet.
Right. And it's important to have that discussion too. I mean, we internally investigate these things, but we also want to be able to say, at the tactic of raising and linking, of saying, look, this is what's popping into the news. Don't let them, let you forget that these are the different issues that were attached to this. The perspective. I mean, they often in the United States like to say both sides of the argument. In the United States, there's only really one side ever presented in the media, and that's the capitalist argument. So whatever they're telling you, no, there's a larger story, but also B, there are probably some victims they're ignoring to sort of justify their actions. And that as an approach is something that we have to still develop a little bit better, but that we're working toward. It's, step one is acknowledge the contemporaneous event. Step two is dissuade people from taking the capitalist line seriously. And three is actually investigating what happened and what people need to know about it.
Yeah, that's a nice take. Like I told you, I watch lots of streamers, and it was this moment, and they were outraged, but then that passed, and it's a bit of not only these services, but it's a cheap shot at putting yourself in the front of others as a human being. You cheapen yourself by engaging in this kind. Oh, what's this? It's August. It's the retreat from Afghanistan. I have to say something, but then I forget. As for example, the conflict with the Palestinians. That's going for from many years, but only suddenly now once a year, like it's I don't know, the Christmas or a holiday. Once a year, we get outraged by this conflict, and I find that a bit appalling.
Well, it certainly is. I think part of it is the way that capitalists control the media landscape to begin with. They sort of control emotional responses. I mean, it's deliberate. I mean, but I think that in terms of getting beyond it, one of the biggest things that I think the proletarian institution of a party needs to do is to build a new civil society, based around new ideas. I think the best way to avoid sort of fatigue in the constant hemorrhaging of crisis after crisis, and sort of the fickle, maybe even bots on the internet of people who are outraged about this position one day and outraged about the next day, to avoid sort of that emotional distress. I think it's important to take it at your own pace. One of the things I've known comrades to do is they go through their media and they pick out what they want to investigate, what they think is actually important, or what line of argument they think is particularly toxic, and they write it down. They don't engage with it right away. They don't go to the comment section and start a flame war. They instead go and they write it down. They take the thread and they investigate it as best they can, and they do whatever productive work they can with it. Sometimes it's organizing a protest. Sometimes it's organizing a new type of literature drop and disseminating posters or agitprop of some design. Really, you have to just. The biggest issue with the way social media is managed by the capitalists is how overwhelming it is, emotionally, mentally, psychologically. Really, you have to stop playing the game, and you have to take it at your own pace, and you have to find ways to do that. It's hard. It's also disheartening to see reliable comrades in the comments saying truly ridiculous things like based Taliban is based, because the Taliban are theocratic fascists.
Yeah,
It's hurtful to see such things because they're not, they're thinking they're not thinking in terms of the people who are actually being hurt. They're thinking of, oh yeah, I get to score points against the United States government. Like I don't understand that, but it's gonna be there. It's possible. I always assume two things. First, that if it's something truly egregious, if it's someone I don't recognize, it's probably not a real person, because at this stage in the internet, we all know how many bots there are. And second of all, there are more productive things to do with your time than to try to correct someone on the opposite end. And we can talk about sort of internet culture and how it's toxicified or solidified or metastasized in capitalism's terms, but under capitalism. But I think Chan culture and the fascists who have propagated that in a coordinated campaign, it can't really be ignored that everything you see on the internet is part of a coordinated campaign. It's really hard for me to get too emotionally invested in one particular story without recognizing the sort of material conditions of the internet in the modern era, if you will.
yeah, exactly. And you put it, you detailed it very nicely, and I like that because if you go with the flow, you end up, like you said, on the two sides of the situation, and they will appear like the only options. Either A, you get engaged you get caught into the flame wars, and you get up to saying up to the most egregious, dumb stuff possible. And B, you say, yeah, that's too consuming for me, and you turn your back and you don't interact with it, which is again another extremely problematic position. But then you started saying, hey, don't engage in that from the top of your emotional state. Uh, Write it down, take a step back, chill. The topic will not go anywhere, and on the long term, you will be able to have a more coherent position, and you'll be able to give more real, proper argument and have a better understanding and a better way of explaining things, and it will be better for everyone and everything. It will be better for the discourse, for you personally and mentally and emotionally, and for the other persons involved, because they will see a more coherent person instead of saying, yeah, Taliban based and stuff, while saying, yeah, men can go to school, but we don't know when women will be sent to school, will be allowed to return to school, but they are based like that's insane. So you save yourself the trouble of saying stupid stuff, and you keep your mental health and emotional sanity, and yeah, that helps the discourse. But still, um, how do you find the strength to, because ultimately the internet, and I'm not saying that is a conspiracy, the Illuminati are putting all these bots and all these evil comments. I believe each company understand, each newspaper understand that if they have a board of messages, forum comments and stuff, they will pay individuals to write extreme takes in order to create a ruckus, to create conflict and have these conflicted opinions create more interactions, which are turning into clicks, engagement, and of course money. So I'm not saying that there is one entity, the Illuminati, saying everybody should do that, but somehow all the companies are seeing it as a good way of engaging with not a good way, a way, an efficient way of getting clicks and interactions from the people. How do you stay away from that? What do you put in its place?
So, if we're talking about, well, what would a socialist media landscape look like?
Yes.
Yeah. So that would be? I mean, it's hard to describe immediately, but I mean, it's important to remember profit motive is so central to how many of these companies and firms operate in terms of what they decide to produce. Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post, and all of a sudden, it started getting more and more corporatist in its language. I mean, it was bad before, but then it really started to crank up. And same with The Hill. You can see the influence of investors and owners in writing because people have to feed the bottom line. They have to feed what they perceive as essential, which is interaction and, to be the news media um, uh, institution, you have to sort of be the most read. You don't necessarily always have to have the best thing to say, which I find rather amusing. But if you want to collectivize print media in any way, any real form, you have to remove the profit motive. And under socialism, that's what you seek to do. So, in terms of what that would look like, ideally, you would have a government institution which provides funding to individual collectives of writers who produce productive work with regulated standards, with ethics standards they have to follow, with tone standards they have to follow, so they can't just ratchet up to the most extreme issue. I mean, the thing is like when people talk about censorship in the modern era, they're always talking about the most ridiculous things, like, oh, they're trying to bury X idea or X story. Really, it's the idea of you have to bury propaganda. You actually have to fight against propaganda because misinformation is so deadly these days. I mean, look at COVID. We had a once in a lifetime, hopefully, pandemic that emerged, and people are still debating whether or not it's real, even though the body count in the United States is more than the Spanish flu. I mean, it's ridiculous. The level of dissemination of misinformation is insane. So I think, when you collectivize writing and journalism, you have to focus on, how do you disarm propaganda in writing? How do you focus on journalism and contemporaneous information? How do you focus on reporting instead of hyperbole? That's going to be difficult. That's not going to be easy to do. But I think with everything, removing the profit motive, setting up a grant system, setting up ethics systems, ethics standards that are regularly enforced across industries that aren't normally regulated in the free market, I think it's a good first step. I don't know what the final form will look like, but I think that would be where I would encourage people to look into.
And like with the same with the topic of internet security, either for organization or for private citizen, this would be another great topic for discussion, maybe with a panel, because otherwise everybody can see, hey, the internet is being already taken over by these entities, not at a global conspirational level, but simply put, each organization, newspaper, a form wants to get clicks and interactions and impressions and likes and whatever they are dealing with. And that's a problem. And the next reaction is, hey, I don't have the power of Facebook, and I don't have the money of whatever other platform of Twitter to start my own platform. And therefore you end up into a corner, a point where I can't do anything. But if we have this kind of conversation and proper logical discourse is being said, is being put out there, people will start thinking, hey, yeah, there is an alternative, and why not? Let's try it, let's engage with it, let's build something better. And this is how we show people things can be done outside of the sort of impossible escape or to escape box of the capitalist environment. Okay, so I have more questions, but are there any sort of topics or perspectives that you want to bring up and say, hey, look, this is something that we are interested in?
I don't necessarily have any immediately. I think we actually talked about most of what I wanted to go over. The only thing I would sort of point to is one of as my personal history is I actually I started as an intern in in the Democratic Party. And I saw field offices and I saw how people were treated. The experience you can get from the electoral system and those logistics is ideological as well as practical. I would encourage people to not necessarily dismiss whatever tangible experience they can get involved with, because you can really see how people are abused and how a socialist system could replace those institutions, and how they go about conducting themselves, as well as just politically having the wrong line. There were people who were literally in high school or in college who took that internship and who were being completely overworked. I think there was even a single parent, and they were just being asked, they were supposed to do an internship of 30 hours a week, and they ended up working something like 60 plus hours a week for their local field office. I mean, there are ways in which you can see the impacts of capitalism at its political level, while gaining practical experience. It's not just that you learn how to operate a logistical center like a field office. It's that you understand what they're supposed to do, what they're really trying to disseminate, and you can really see how people interact with them under capitalism. And I'm not advertising the Democratic Party here, but it was very educational. I think it was one of the most educational experiences I had as a communist, because I wasn't yet part of a party, and I was still trying to figure out who I was and what I believed. And seeing that stark example was part of my revolutionary process, if not what I would encourage for other people who are sort of on the fence.
Yeah, and I totally agree with this perspective, because you don't need to agree ideologically entirely 100% with the Democratic Party, with the Republican, but the huge amount of organizational infrastructure they have available for you to go in and learn, it's something that the communists simply don't have the resources to replicate. And if you want to build a huge organization, you need to understand the rope of how a huge organization is being built and maintained. Not saying that you need to copy 100% what they are doing, but at least you need to be aware of the scale of things and the amount of resources and either people, offices, printers, laptops, or whatever. You need to put in the manpower, the man hours of work you need to have available in order to build something big. Otherwise, you are just selling yourself short, and not being aware, you will very fast reach this point, and that will be a problem without a solution. And I cannot build bigger, and thus I will fail, or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to reiterate that. I didn't necessarily have an additional point beyond it. But what other questions did you have?
Oh, yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, and in the same time, I've read a tweet of some person, don't have it right now in my immediate reach, and he was talking, I believe it was that person was a he. He was talking about he got involved with AOC's campaign, and he went from door to door, and he talked with the people. He got chased out by the members of those community, got the police called on him a couple of times. Some dogs bite him and stuff, and he literally was 1 year later saying that he somehow regrets the what AOC turned out to be. But in my mind, I saw that person as being one who had a great experience, a great time experiencing firsthand what it means to work with the people and to achieve something. Because ultimately, he was one of the many people who helped elect AOC, and he was successful in that. And people should look to what are other organizations doing. Well, this is what they are doing. The people who got AOC elected aren't magical fairy beings doing magical things and stuff like that. No, they are ordinary people doing a specific amount of things which can be quantified, properly explained, and spread over many days and stuff to have the time to do them. But at the end of those activities, very specific, very well measured, you get a certain result. And it's that simple. But again, this kind of stuff isn't properly explained, and it looks mythical. Oh, the people elected somebody. Yes, but they were still people, just with a spreadsheet of checks and things to do, a to-do list, and they successfully elected one person into Congress. Now, every other organization can replicate that if they are willing, but that would mean for people to really pay attention and understand.
Well, yeah, it takes time. That's the biggest issue. The working class is sort of stretched as thin as it can be by its employers, and so most people feel too exhausted to even try. But I really, it's actually really funny. When I was when I first went to college, one of the things one of my family members told me was just take each day and figure out how much time it's really going to take to do each task. You know, not everything is going to be due the same day. Figure out what you can do. Try to put at least an hour or two aside for studying, you know, and that's it. You have to just isolate what you can do from what you feel you're going to be expected to do, because that has to do with emotions of anxiety and anticipation. You have to sort of get your personal expectations under control and focus on the long term. It's extremely hard to come home from work and then get onto an hour phone call of organizing. I mean, you're just mentally drained from any whatever job you're doing. You know, sort of the mental process of just coming home and trying to unwind and trying to refocus is hard. But you know, pick what you can do. In field offices, often, you know, you get volunteers for a day. You don't get them for a full week. You get them for a day once a week, or you get them for a few hours each day at most, you know, if you're lucky. You have to figure out what you can do. Some people rise really high in field offices because they have basic leadership skills, or they can manage a schedule. Um, you know, figure out what you can do. If you're not comfortable talking on the phone with people or going out and knocking on doors, you can create literature. You can manage a timetable. You can, you know, make sure everyone in the field office has lunch. I mean, it's really like pick what you feel you can do and go from there. Um, I've noticed a lot of comrades gain a lot of good experience doing mutual aid because they plan a mutual aid event once a week, and they have to figure out all the logistics leading up to the day, and then they do the day, and that's what they're able to do. And they build skills doing that. They work collectively, they work with people, they interact with the general public, and they gain confidence and ability doing it. So you have to figure out what you're able to do, and that sometimes requires some difficult questions. I'm in a financially difficult situation. You know, I'm still in a COVID area, in an area where COVID is rampant. Um, I don't have a vaccine yet. You know, all sorts of things. I work 40 hours. I can only give 20, maybe on the weekend. I mean, you have to really figure out what you can do. And that's hard. That's a process unto itself, but start with an hour a day. Figure out what you can do inside of an hour. Everyone has at least 1 hour. It's probably an hour they should be sleeping in most cases, but everyone has at least 1 hour where they can figure out what they can do, or at least think about what they can do.
Yeah, totally. And that's why when we discussed earlier about having that sort of organizational template that can tell you from the start that, hey, you don't have to be present there 24/7. You just need to properly allocate resources to people, and you tell them from the start, hey, we only need you for 1 hour or 2 hours or for this specific amount of time. And if you can't do it, there is another who can take your place, and that's sort of a very good mental burden to be taken off the people who engage with you. And yeah, going out in the community and working with the people, it's very important. In one of my first streams, I had a Shibi from UK, and he was talking about his work on the field. maybe, and he was saying that he is willing to talk and develop the maybe exchange some know-how and information with people from the US on how you do things over there and compare notes. Maybe we can set up this kind of stuff. Somebody who is managing one of your community projects and have them together and have a conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if we want to build a proper international collective, we've got to start at some level. Absolutely.
Okay, so talking about specifics in the US, do you have any topics that you are interested in? Like, I don't know, would you like to solve something in education or the infrastructure? Because I know all the, like with the previous topic, if you say, hey, we want to build the next party which will achieve the next revolution, that's an insanely huge goal, and
Yeah.
it's overwhelming up to the point of nope, I'm going to the pub and have a beer and I don't know, spend time with my wife and kids and the dog and stuff like that. But if you break it down, it's much more manageable. So what topics? Because I know there are lots of problems in the US and in other countries, of course, but what is on your radar these days, like the healthcare, the infrastructure, and specifically in your area?
Primarily in my area, it's actually transportation. In rural Vermont, people are entirely dependent on cars. There's very few bus routes that actually lead anywhere that people need to get to on a reliable basis. That go more than twice a day, and that don't take more than 3 hours. I mean, it's pretty insane. In Vermont, in particular, we actually historically had trains that actually ran to just about every town in the entire state. It was pretty rare that you couldn't get to a town by train. The issue is that it was supported by freight traffic and exports to Boston and to other states. And financially speaking, Vermont was never able to rebuild it because it was too expensive a project. The modernization was too high. Most of the train tracks had actually been torn up, and the property, the sort of the actual physical locations where most of the train stations existed were sold off as private land, and was not sort of revamped publicly in any meaningful way. The internet also goes down with that because, uh, frankly, in terms of that kind of infrastructure, Vermont is just barely getting fiber optic cable to some of its major towns outside of Chittenden County, where our largest city is, which is about 40,000 people. Vermont is a very small state, but transportation is the primary issue because in Vermont you have such strict requirements for inspections of your vehicle that vehicles that a person could ordinarily afford may not actually be able to pass inspection. And so it's a huge financial burden to own and maintain a car. But having one is essential for probably maintaining your income. So one of the biggest projects that I would like to see undertaken in particularly Vermont is the reconstituting of the railways and a modern rail network. We already have the federal rail line Amtrak, which operates on the western half of the state and goes down. It's a major line that actually goes down the western side of Vermont and heads into Massachusetts and then into New York City. It's one of the trains that actually you can take to get to New York City directly. So expanding off of that rail line to reach other major towns in Vermont would be a good starting point. Operating and setting up a system of public transportation, primarily of buses, if possible, for the immediate instance, and just making sure anyone can get from any town to any other town on a reliable basis would be a major infrastructure project, regardless of the roads or how long the rail took to modernize. That would at least help people get where they needed to go. You know, you don't have to have. You could have the major arteries like Montpelier and Burlington connected, Montpelier and St. Johnsbury, and then Montpelier and Rutland connected, and then you could have local systems disseminate people from major town centers or um, uh, or transit centers and get them to where they need to go, because it's really it's it's almost impossible to describe. Most of Vermont roads are what's known as secondary roads, so they have 2 lanes, um, but and they are paved, but then even more roads um, are not paved, so they're dirt roads, and so they go off into the hill, and you have to either hike it in the middle of winter, or you have to have a car that has 4-wheel drive and studded tires because you're not making it that far otherwise. I mean, just being able to get people where they need to be, even a little bit of relief through a bus transit system would be huge. I mean, people wouldn't have such a burden on their daily lives just being able to get places reliably in a reasonable amount of time. Because Vermont
Okay,
does not have heavy amount of traffic. It's like you can take an hour to get from one side of the state to the other.
okay. So this infrastructure and public, with the perspective, from the perspective of public transportation, would be one of the uh, topics that you would engage your regular average, the other citizens, and say, hey, look, this is what we are proposing, and this is why you should join us and work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Most Vermonters are painfully aware. I mean, you can't, even if you don't have a car and you are willing to pay a private fee, like a taxi, to go somewhere, you can't even find reliable taxis. And that's saying you can afford it. Um, it's a very common problem. That's the type of issue you need to engage with people. It's, you know, socialism is it's you need to break it down for them. Socialism is about making sure that the basic necessities of life are not denied people on a basis of cost. That the social need is prioritized over the financial need. And putting it in a collective system is more efficient. I mean, the government puts out grants for 2 companies already, 2 separate chartered companies for reduced cost or free fare for certain areas, but no one covers the entirety of all the major towns or all the routes. So being able to train and hire, reliable state employees with a civil service income is is a pretty substantial would have a pretty substantial impact on most people's lives.
Okay, and I know that usually infrastructure and public transportation projects are associated with a good amount of paperwork, feasibility studies and impact studies and environmental and so on. Do you have this kind of logistics and finances to support this kind of paperwork to produce it, or how are you going to deal? Are you going to use existing paperwork and available data? Are you building your own? Where do you draw the experience to say, hey, we are not just some commies who say public transportation is good because we are commies. Here, this is the data we have, and this is how we got to this answer.
So as I said, the bus system would be an overlay for a final train system. In terms of energy production, Vermont actually produces most of its energy domestically. At least it did until about a decade ago when we shut down 2 nuclear power plants. They were not properly managed by the state government, they were contracted out. Um, the first step would be into guaranteeing both the financial and energy cost could be paid for. So on the financial side, you would have to create what we propose as a statewide credit union. Vermont is not known for a robust economy in the first place, so the number of private banks is pretty minimal. And secondly, most of those private banks don't pay particularly high taxes on capital on capital that they generate. So the first thing would be to pass a set of tax laws which would modify the existing capital gains tax so that the private banks were sufficiently taxed, and use the money to set up a collective system for a credit union for the state, and that would help bring in both income to the state and provide a service to the ordinary citizen in banking and basic banking affairs that they need. It could also provide loans to the state when it did public works projects. In terms of the number of people that would have to be serviced, Vermont is only 640,000 people. So we're not talking about a particularly large demand system. New York City has more demand. I mean, actually, Boston, the city of Boston, has more people in demand on the T than the entire state of Vermont does. So if we're looking at comparison studies, we could study the metro line in Boston as a pretty one-to-one comparison. We could also use the existing infrastructure of Amtrak and expand it and modernize it to make more reliable rail. So that'd be using the federal existing infrastructure and expanding it. As I said previously, rail in Vermont actually does have infrastructure. It's just been neglected. So reclaiming that infrastructure through eminent domain or grants from the local towns would be pretty easy and could be negotiated in the state legislature using existing methods and paperwork. The other thing you could do for local governments is you could provide a manufacturer. You could research and provide a manufacturer that could be reliably used, and you could either build a new manufacturer inside the state of Vermont, or you could use an existing one that had appropriate environmental standards, and do a single grant contract rather than, 2 or 3 or half a dozen. And then you could have a sunset clause. And you can attach whatever requirements you want to that. You want a manufacturer that is collectivized. You want a manufacturer that has this price point, et cetera, et cetera. You essentially could make a collective bargain to make sure that certain ethical standards were met. And that would be the bus line while the train is being studied and produced. And in terms of the energy cost, reestablishing nuclear power in the state of Vermont or expanding the existing wind program would be the way in which the energy cost would be paid for, because you would want to use electric rail and not be reliant on fossil fuels, which Vermont has none of domestically. We actually don't even have natural gas domestically as a resource.
Yeah, so I was asking about how would you approach the topic, because I've seen I've read during the years about a line in Florida. I believe it was a train line or some sort of light rail type of line, and they had lots of problems with that. And then there is the example, which is a pretty negative example, with high-speed train, I believe, in a valley somewhere in California, famous name. Don't have it on top of my mind. You have the example of high-speed rail in Spain, and all those were projects which were sold to the local government as being profitable. But if we look in what they measured, what they numbered, the amount of citizens, they are like severely under the overstated, and almost everything in that project was a lie and was set up to fail. So if you want to come up with a better project, you'll not only have to fight sort of against the existing problems, but you'll have to fight the promises, the huge promises of the existing capitalist system, which, like I've said, if we look into them, we can clearly see that they are problematic, and over the time, those projects consume more money than they produce, and they are not even close to a net zero or something like that. So it's a high stake for you to solve there.
It is. And this is just one of the issues that we try to campaign on. But I would argue that part of the reason they failed was because the local government and its oversight took the capitalists at their word and tried to, listened to the free market as to what was going to be a profitable line, and the goal was profitable. The goal was not to improve access over a period of time. One of the best benefits of a socialist system is central planning. The 5-year plans, the 4-year plans, the 2-year plans. You can scale this as you need to over time to make it affordable or reasonable. And like I said, the number of people we're talking about that need to be serviced are less than 1 million. And we're talking about only a handful of major towns that really need to be connected by rail. And you're talking about a hybrid system, one that will be phased out in favor of another over time. So you can argue it two ways. You can say, look, these previous projects were not properly regulated. They were not. The rail companies were given way too much latitude. This is going to be a public works, not a public contract. The initial phase of buses may be more of a public contract side, but you can figure that out as you're planning it. But the goal is to build a public work. It is to build a utility that is available to people. It's not something that will be a private company asset. So you could argue the regulation side. The other side you could argue is public interest. This is being done not in the name of profit, but public interest. The goal is not to build the track, the rail out of the cheapest possible material to get the job done. It's to make sure it lasts. The existing infrastructure for rail that is still used commercially is in horrible shape. It would not be hard for Vermont officials to go out and inspect those rails and to figure out how and when they could be improved and what would it take to convert them to an electric rail. You could get case studies and hard data very easily because you would know the previous routes that existed, where they were, how much traffic they had, and scale that up as needed. There's the data is there. You just have to collect it and investigate it and approach it not as a single solution or as a single bill, but as a economic plan, as a layered project. This would probably, in terms of legislation, require several pieces of legislation, and you would do different phases as different pieces of legislation. Whenever this phase is completed and has met its standards, then you go on to the next phase. You don't try to do it all in one go. Otherwise, you will end up with overwhelming costs, regardless if it's private or public funded, because you've given them too much of a leeway and they're not due diligence and not proper oversight. It'll also give you time to do research on the later phases once you've started.
Yeah, but in a true capitalist way, who will gonna give and who will gonna receive the bribes? Sorry, the lobby money and stuff like that. Come on.
Who would receive the lobby money? Yeah, I mean, ideally, you're not trying to get any lobby money to go to anyone. You're trying to publicly invest, and probably this is just a slight difference in how state legislatures operate. But local governments usually don't have the resources to investigate as thoroughly as they should, which is why this needs to be coordinated at the state level. It's not something a municipality could do. It would require a commission. Probably you'd have to have a number of socialist representatives elected to get it really off the ground. There are committees that people operate out of state legislatures. You would have to get done. In a truly socialist system, this would be a federal project. This would be a national project. This wouldn't even be an issue for the locals to have to deal with. You would have a national transportation agency that would coordinate all the different needs. But we don't have that. We would, on a local campaign and a local argument, you would say that this is the best way. Do it phase by phase. Make sure you have the state legislature on top of it. Don't let it get into the feuds of the different towns, because we actually don't have county government. We have town government and we have state government in the state of Vermont. We don't have county government. The only county government we have are the courts, the arbitration courts and the superior courts, and this, of course, the Supreme Court of the state. We don't have county authorities or utility authorities, and that would be part of what you would have to build.
Yeah, and with a good enough degree of transparency, preferably as high as possible, that can be also traceable, and everybody can come and keep the people involved with this project accountable and so on, and prevent various mishappening
Well, yeah,
from.
that's the benefit of having a party, is that you can direct attention, right? If a party undertakes a project at a governmental level, you can have the party that's not elected but is still operating with the people. You can direct attention as needed. This segment is not doing its job. Let's direct attention. Let's try to make sure there's public attention where there needs to be. Make sure that whatever contracts are signed are done so with the public will in mind, and so on.
Yeah, definitely, because people get into these projects, but they forget about the transparency and how much the other people can come up with idea and help and point out, hey, this can become a problem in the future. Take care of it now. And right now, with the existing way of how the government works, you cannot simply, as a private citizen, go to the government and say, hey, this will become a problem. It will take months for that paper request or inquiry of yours to be taken into account, other months to be discussed, and years, if ever, to be implemented, acted upon, and you have a solution implemented. So, yeah, we definitely need to change this aspect of the government.
Oh, absolutely. And let's not forget electoralism. It's the whole productive part of electoralism is that you're getting people to understand the limitations of capitalist government. The whole point is to get them to participate in a portion of the revolutionary struggle and understand its necessity. To say, like, look, this is the public corruption. This is the obvious issue that we can deal with. This is what we can see, and all the things we can't see need to be investigated. And we need to understand that, the level of transparency in capitalist government isn't particularly great, and it gets even worse after they're elected. So you need to find a way to champion to the people that, look, these are the things that people need. These are the projects and proposals that we have. We're going to accomplish this through central planning. Anyone can read and correct our work. That's totally fine with us. But the capitalist system won't allow this to permeate, because it would deny profit. It would deny accessibility and vulnerability to the system. It would promote centralized planning, and that's something that can't be allowed. So it's important to understand that when you're championing these proposals, what we're often doing is saying, like, this is what we want to try. This is what we want to do. This is how we think we're going to do it. This is the method we're going to use to make sure it works. And then when you get that idea popularized enough and people try to co-opt it, you can point out how capitalism fails to do anything productive, because it tries to take the market portions it can accept out of your plan or privatize what it doesn't accept. And then it fails and it collapses because of issues you're just talking about: transparency, lobbying, corruption, large and small, at the local and at the state level. I mean, it permeates throughout the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, I have a project that I'm starting now about how to better understand the policing police actions and policing, because we all are aware that from time to time we see horrific events of shooting done by the police, and we say yes, policing is bad, and I totally feel for the victims, and many of those people didn't deserve to die, to be shot and have their lives destroyed. But beyond that, I believe the amount of people who encounter problems with the police on a daily basis, like, is insanely higher, obviously, than the amount of people who get shot by the police. And not to diminish the shootings, but this daily small type of evil encounter, I believe they amass ultimately to a greater amount of evil done by and corruption, moral corruption or financial, done by the institutions and the people serving in these institutions, and of course by the state through these institutions. And I am saying that, hey, we should watch and reinterpret how the police is interacting with the citizens, because ultimately, right now, if we look at citizen police interaction on the internet, we can see plenty of examples in which they start interacting with you from the perspective you are already guilty. So the idea of, oh, my constitution and the magical line, innocent until proven guilty, were thrown out of the window long time ago. So we need to take a look of how these interactions go, and we need to come up with better metrics, more transparent metrics, which are being put at the disposal, made available to the citizens, and of course have the police made aware of this and have these checks and balances, so this huge amount of injustices and escalations just simply stop and disappear, instead of saying, hey, the police are bad and corrupt, defund, and go with the extreme, like defund the police or stop the policing, because police will be necessary now and tomorrow. So we need to come with a better system of measuring things and making it available to the citizens and to empower them to keep the state accountable.
Yeah, and I would say that there are actually 3 different approaches I've heard of that in tandem I think would be very effective. First, it's important to recognize that there is no real national qualification required to become a police officer. There's no institution in which people go to at a national level to train to be a sort of ordinary cop, right? There are state police and they are trained. There's the national federal police and they are trained, but there's no local equivalent because the expense is just too great. The police academies are extremely limited in their jurisdiction and who they service. In fact, most police officers are actually recruited from military academies from cadets who graduate. And it's pretty astounding, but it's true. And from veterans. So they approach the civilian police approach the issue and not necessarily a mindset that's productive as a combat situation. So I think that's important to understand, is that a national institution which trains police to be police and requires more than 1 year of study would be a highly productive institution. But second to that, I think that municipalities, local workers' councils, when they're formed, having a control over the local police and direct supervision would be, and their regulation would be immensely powerful, because right now police departments are regulated internally. They regulate themselves.
We investigated ourselves and
we concluded we're not guilty. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's a front that would be implementable pretty easily. But I think the third approach that's not often talked about is how anti-democratic the police institution is. I mean, they have life and death power over people, but the chief of police is a dictator. They're appointed through internal recruitment and through maybe limited county or town election. I think it needs to be universal. I think any police chief that oversees the lives and potential destruction of the lives of more than 10,000 people or even less, it's arguable, needs to be held accountable through public election. And I think that it's important to understand that while police should be civil servants, they're a civil servant that has an absurd amount of power for their position. And the amount of poor regulation and inconsistent regulation across the 50 states is utterly reprehensible. There's no other institution that has that kind of power that is not as well regulated. I mean, you could kind of argue the FBI is poorly regulated, but what I mean is, the army has higher standards, and the police often act like an occupying force, and the army has higher standards of treatment of civilians than the police, which is saying something given that we live in an imperial core.
Yeah. Totally agree with what you said. And again, we need to make a tool and make it available to the people. And when they get into an interaction with the police, they should, I don't know, pull out a piece of paper or pull out their smartphones and say, hey, first thing first. Of course, we are talking about the majority of the interactions, which I would assume there are for small things happening, not about crimes, shootings, or whatever other hot topics. But if you encounter, what are the steps? And the citizens should pull out that piece of paper and say, hey, these are the steps that you should follow when you encounter me. And this is what you should do, and this is what you shouldn't do. And if you do this, we have a friendly conversation and you respect my rights. If not, you can buzz off and let me be, or I'll take money out of from you in court and stuff like that. But again, whatever form of a tool this might take, the citizens really need to have it, because there are like too many incidents where the citizens are oblivious to their rights and their, of course, duties and how they should conduct in such interactions.
Absolutely. I mean, that goes to the larger issue of how do you politically educate the larger population on civics. They're deliberately not taught. It's extremely important that they understand their rights, and the best possible way to get out of a difficult, potentially deadly situation. If there's a particular branch of service which is consistently threatening people's lives over interactions, or just making those interactions particularly difficult and abusing their authority, that has to be. I mean, you can't just rely on regulation. You have to actively, publicly educate the public. You have to publicly educate the citizens on how best to guarantee that the situation goes smoothly. What is it the officer is really asking? What are you obligated to tell them, et cetera, et cetera. I think that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I will make a video upon this and describe my general idea, because I'm still asking for feedback from the people around me, but I'll make a video and put it on my channel, maybe send it to you and get input and maybe start something on this area. So policing also connects sort of with the topic of unions, and this is how they have some powers. But we also see, I recently read about the John Deere situation. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, the right to repair.
Oh yeah, that's an awesome topic. But I've okay. Let's get into that. What do you think about the right to repair?
Well, I think it's absurd that we have to go to a right to repair instead of just, I mean, this is the issue of intellectual property, right? It's the idea that a company can own the very concept of a produced item or product, and that they can prohibit certain activity that would cost them potential funding, which is just, I mean, it's like racketeering. It's a whole new level of absurdity. I mean, if you purchase an item, I mean, markets aside, you should. It's about ownership. Isn't the whole premise of capitalism about ownership? And I mean, they're getting to such a point where it's an extreme. But the right to repair, I mean, if you're talking on a socialist system, this wouldn't even be a debate. It's a it's an implement you need to do your work, and your productivity is your value is tied to your productivity, and it's in your collective well-being of other people. It's absolutely essential that you be able to have the equipment you need and that it be properly maintained. Under socialism, you wouldn't have to rely on such, really villainous equipment sales. You would instead go to a central agency and you would say, I need these tools to do this job, and they would distribute it to you. And they'd say, it would be a collectivized, planned economy. You wouldn't necessarily need to buy equipment on this scale. I mean, it's really absurd that they think that because they originally created the product, that they own it in perpetuity, and that any attempt to alter or modify the tool that you are using after you've made a purchase, that they continue to extract wealth from you because only they should have the answers. I mean, it shows the desperation of the monopolies really, really clearly, that they need to extract even more wealth from the proletariat, and they need to do it now through the tools that they originally produced. I mean, I don't think a single capitalist would try to turn down the opportunity to, double dip in terms of getting additional expenses from their customers if they could. This needs to be dealt with as soon as humanly possible. But in a socialist system, this question wouldn't even be up for debate. It would just be dealt with.
Yeah, that's a great point, because ultimately we are talking about the people already being punished by the fact that through the means of making them pay more than what they should, because you already bought the tractor or the agricultural uh, machine, but now you have to pay on a yearly basis, and now we are past that. They are trying to punish you. They will punish you if you want to modify things in that, and that's like getting to absurd amounts of oversight and power given to the corporations. And yeah, I totally agree that should stop. And also on this topic, there is Luis Rossmann. He has an Apple, iPhone, Mac repair channel. He has a business in New York City. He goes to all these meetings. This is how I've got more custom with the topic of rights of repair. Anyone who wants to learn about the topic, they should watch and watch his channel, because he did very interesting stuff. He had a small shop in New York City, and he started talking about how to repair your laptop or iPhone, or at least investigate and find out. And slowly he built an audience, and he started saying, "Hey, look, Apple is selling you bad products, and they are not only bad, they are shit products, and they are designed to fail very, very fast." And there is an evolution of his channel and of his discourse, and he is going through all these stages of capitalists when corporation creating more problems and more roadblocks for the consumers, and punishing them and charging them more for stupid things that shouldn't be happened. And they declare, "Oh, but this is our business model, and this is how we make money, and this is what you should dream for." Like, I kind of disagree. Anyway, and the point was that this person, Luis Rossmann, actually made it to several, I believe there are state hearings about on the topic of rights to repair, and he is exposing the other lobbyists, and he says, "Hey, look, this is the person who is being paid by that company, and they are paid by those corporations, and they are lying through their teeth, and they are misinforming you," and stuff like that. And ultimately, as far as I've understood, people got around him, and somehow his idea of rights to repair made it in one of the papers on Joe Biden's table, and somehow Biden mentioned that should be a type of action taken on this topic. And it's an interesting evolution of a person who had a small shop and was by himself with a couple of employees and stuff, and how one person got involved with the state and exposed the problems and got bigger and bigger, and ultimately is almost changing the status quo and winning again in front of against this insurmountable, what would seem like insurmountable odds.
Well, we have examples of this throughout American history, actually, pretty well established as a pattern. I don't think it's a coincidence that this person was originally a business owner who was, operating a repair shop. That's often where the tension is, right? If we do a class analysis, the tension is between the petty bourgeoisie and the monopolies, the larger capitalist institutions. And oftentimes it's those petty bourgeoisie who argue against capitalism on the basis of morality rather than on a scientific basis of replacing the system. And so you see this is being slowly co-opted, but notice how they're only talking about the right to repair. And I think the fact that that the fact that it has gained national attention. I mean, Bernie Sanders in the last presidential election brought it up consistently as an issue. But many capitalists will seek to defend intellectual property any way they can. I don't think this fight is far from over. I think this fight is far from over, and I think that it'll be interesting to see the class dynamics play out. But I think that this is sort of like an easy win because there's ways to mitigate the worst of capitalist behavior without, giving the people what they really need. And we see this all the way going back to FDR. In fact, it's actually a favorite interview of mine between H.G. Wells and Stalin, where they talk about incremental change in capitalist systems and how, whether or not you can slowly regulate your way to socialism. And Stalin puts it really well in his articulation that, like, well, you're not fundamentally challenging the financial basis of capitalism. And it doesn't necessarily have to be every victory has to be that victory. But you have to understand this in a class context. You have to say right to repair affects small business owners the most, and capitalists, especially the Democrats, build their constituencies off of votes of the petty bourgeoisie. That's where they get the most public visibility of support during campaigns. So I would be surprised if right to repair wasn't regulated, if not by written law, then by executive order or by rulings in individual states, as you mentioned. But it's going to be a long time before right to repair gains enough support in the United States among the political class for there to be a serious limitation on the monopolies. And between now and then, there's going to be a lot of people who are struggling. But yeah, if he's putting out information about what they can do, more power to them.
Yeah, well, he always talks from his perspective as a business owner, not necessarily challenging. He's complaining about the situation with the real estate in New York City. He talks about lots of problems that he encounters around him. But what I'm trying to put out there is the idea that he was just one person who got involved in the process, just one person, and slowly people got together around him, and then he got to talk with the people who are making the laws and telling his side. And not necessarily that we should replicate, but it's a good example of, hey, he started, he had his convictions. He wasn't some form of Superman. He wasn't the second coming of Stalin or something like that.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
achieved.
No, absolutely.
He achieved. Yeah.
Sorry.
He achieved. No, it's okay. He achieved things, and that's what you could do. That's what you should do if you want to change the situation. Don't expect this magical mythical figure to come and know everything. Just go and talk with your local representatives and say, hey, this is a problem. Help me solve it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
No, go ahead.
All right. I was just going to say that's ideally what you would want is democracy appropriately impacting capitalism or socialism, as it were.
Okay, so the other topic of John Deere I wanted to touch upon. Let me see. Share screen. Okay, it's this. On the 10th of October, I believe it was the time when the union, John Deere Workers Union, was supposed to sign a new contract between them and the company, and 90% of the workers, not just the hardliners, 90% of the worker said no, that is a bad deal. And considering how much money in this COVID pandemic years John Deere took from the state, the type of contract was like extremely bad, and they said like, no, we are not satisfied with this. And now you have a union where 90% of the people united and voted against. That's like, wow, extremely powerful thing.
Yeah, no, that's remarkable. I mean, it's unfortunate that John Deere decides to, extract so much wealth from people and then insist it can't pay people more than a 5 to 6% raise. That's more than absurd. But I mean, yeah, I mean, quite frankly, I think the workers had a lot of leverage here, both because of COVID ongoing situation in terms of labor shortages. Well, labor shortages, created by bad pay, but also just the general difficulty of conducting business. The fact that it's, I mean, in a best case scenario, you hope for over 50% of the workforce, and in case of 90%, I mean, that collective bargaining power is going to be great. Is this an already existing union, or did they form a union as a result of this bad contract?
I believe it was an already existing union, but from what I've read, the leadership was like the usual leadership of a union, in bed with the corporate powers, and there were allegations, if not proof, of their corruption. Not sure on the specific details, but if you got to a 90% of the employees getting together, I believe there would be more to the situation than just smoke out of thin air. So yeah, it was an existing union, and somehow they successfully united and said, "Hey, you know what? Who are you? We are the old leadership. Like,
Yeah.
F off. Please disappear. Please get out of the way." And
Well,
let
that's
us.
what you hope for, right? That's what you hope for in a union, is that the membership is aware enough and active enough that it knows what its issues are primary among all, and then among all members, and then the other working conditions that are unfavorable, that maybe are specific to specific workshops that they want to raise. Really, I think this is phenomenal. I hope they really go for it, because a lot of issues people undertake when they go into a strike is how long they can actually maintain a strike.
Survive. Yeah.
But 90% of the workforce, that's a lot of person power. That's a lot of hands to get this done.
Yeah, I've read it like a couple of days ago, and I'm still thinking like, what 90%? Like that's a huge number. It takes a bit of uh, processing and getting accustomed to 90%, because it's one thing to say, well, 30%, 50, 51, but 90%, like that's huge.
Well, yeah, and yeah, I'm sure that most of the workplaces that we see, most people only see the sales floor, but I'm sure there's a whole support staff behind them, where if that's 90%, that's nine out of 10 people. I mean, think about it, how much of a crew you would need to operate a single workspace. I think this could really go somewhere, even if the leadership doesn't want to cooperate or play ball with the rest of the union. The rest of the union can just elect new leadership very easily with 90% participation. You can get everyone to show up at a workplace meeting and hash out, who's going to be our new representative because this person sucks. I mean, that isn't hard. And if 90% of the workers are behind it, I mean, the CEO may want a certain deal over another, but I mean, if one guy doesn't have if the current leadership doesn't have the representative power, if they don't have popular sovereignty, then then your plan to make a more reasonable deal for the capitalists is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So we'll see how that sustainment goes of that momentum. But that they got a lot to work with.
Oh, definitely. Question: do you reach out with if you see not necessarily 90% union with 90% unity, like in this case, but do you reach out to unions and sort of collaborate with them, try to help them learn from their experiences and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, we try to. Quite a few of our members are actually part of a union, in one case or another. Unionization across the United States is pretty low, so we're extremely lucky to have as many comrades as we do interested in union work. But I guess it's a communist party, so that's supposed to be expected. But on the other hand, building unions is something we're actively participating in. We put together a labor commission way ahead of schedule of when we thought we were going to. just because of the amount of union activity we were participating in, to try to help contribute national resources. In terms of contacting unions, it can be difficult. Most of the time, we contact it through members that are already in there and who sort of get information for us by proxy. We're not at the stage yet. We're still a pre-party formation where we don't necessarily have the logistical ability to contact or political clout to contact a union directly and work with them directly. We're not quite there yet. We're hoping to be there soon, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay, so right now you are not thinking on picking up the phone and call John Deere Union headquarters or something like that, but it's definitely on the to-do list.
Yeah, it is, and it's part of and things like this are something the Labor Commission was formed to investigate. So however this goes, we'll take as many lessons as we can get from instances and strikes like this, and we'll do whatever we can to support them by secondary means.
Okay, that's great to hear. Okay, so last time, let's try to wrap it up with this. When we talked the other time, you specifically mentioned micro ideologies preventing us from uniting, and that we should get over these micro differences. Can you elaborate a bit of this? Because it's the topic of sort of the fabled leftist unity, united the left and stuff like that. So,
Oh yeah.
how and around what? How do you solve this? My ideological positions differs in this 2 or 3%, and thus I cannot work with you.
Well, I mean, in terms of what the institution that we're trying to build a Marxist-Leninist party. So we're focused on people who are active participants in organizing and doing party work. If you don't join the party or interact with our institutions, we can't really count you as a communist to begin with. I mean, it's hard for anyone to argue in my eyes that they're a Marxist-Leninist of whatever variety, but they don't believe in establishing a party or working together in a party as a format, because that was Lenin's major contribution after the Second International. That was some of the major points of his April theses. So really, if you count yourself as a Marxist-Leninist of any particular stripe, you just have views that are maybe not so conventional. For me, the important question is, are you going to focus on building an institution, or are you going to focus on, for lack of a better term, polemics? In my view, the best part about Lenin and other theorists is that they weren't interested in just writing theory for theory's sake. They were writing theory to try to direct a future, not just an intellectual movement, but a political one. And it's very important to me that people understand the political nature of what you're trying to do. It's not just about the individual debates, the esoterics. It's about tangible. We're trying to elevate the working class, regardless of what micro ideology you follow. You probably agree that the working class, needs to be risen up in some way. If you don't necessarily support a dictatorship of the proletariat, which I would disagree with, but you want to elevate the well-being of the working class. So if you want to develop a micro ideology, that's your choice. But our institutions, the way we deal with this is that we have a non-sectarian rule. So we have bylaws, we have regulations on how to deal with things like line struggle or things like that. But we're not going to say that just because you join the party that we expect you to be a perfect communist. No one joining a party is a perfect communist. I'm not a perfect communist. You have to learn. You have to educate yourself. You have to participate. You have to go through a developmental process. And some people, when they first start out, they're attached to one micro ideology or tendency and change over time. And personally, I feel that the tendency to change is to become more scientific, less utopian, the more practical experience you have. You begin to learn how things work and how things are optimally done. But individual disputes of like eco-Marxism or Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. I mean, those tendencies have their own problems, and I wish them luck in solving them. But if they joined, if an individual person joined our party and identified as that way, it wouldn't be prohibitive. We would say, okay, that's your ideological position. That's okay. We would judge them more on the character of their productivity, as any good Marxist would do. What do you do for the party? What do you do to help the collective whole? What do you do for the movement? In regards to groups that sort of identify as different tendencies, we actually tend to view them as non-competitive because they're not. We tend to view them in a more collaborative way because they're not trying to do the same thing we're trying to do. They're not trying to establish a central institution. They're not necessarily Leninist, so they're not necessarily trying to advocate for a central party. And those organizations which are, as long as they're not declaring themselves the vanguard, we don't have a problem necessarily with cooperating them on an operational level. And if they're in a pre-party formation stage, we're actually interested in helping them become part of a whole. We're not interested in having dozens of micro-organizations. We're actually interested in building a national institution. So we would invite them in to deliberate and discuss how we could work together, or potentially even host a Congress together. But in terms of, I guess, red lines or red flags, what we worry about is a party with a declared ideology that is opposed or discounts Marxism-Leninism, that does not look to be productive or establish permanent institutions or organizations that support line struggle, because then we have to worry about deliberate infiltration and destructive tendencies inside the party. And I believe really that the worst micro ideology or the most adamant individual believer of a thing is dangerous, because then they won't listen to scientific reasoning. They won't listen to data. They won't listen to experience. They'll just listen to what they personally believe. And that, I think, is extremely destructive.
Yeah, nicely put. By the way, from time to time there is the topic of a violent revolution. Do you have that thing on your radar? Is that a thing for you and your movement?
Well,
going through this?
One of the reasons a lot of us left the previous party because we thought their approach to the January 6th coup attempt was a bit lackluster. It didn't really create any substantial change or attitude. They just released a statement. They didn't try to mobilize politically against it. They didn't. Regards to violent revolution, it really, the subject, I mean, we're just trying to get off the ground as an institution. Just trying to build ourselves up. Violent revolution is it's technically under the purview and investigation of the security department. But really at the end of the day, it's like, well, you can't even begin to talk about violent revolution until you understand what it is you're trying to do. And you can't really dream about what you're trying to do until you have a functional process for doing anything. And I mean, I've seen splits and struggles that happen over, well, you're not revolutionary enough. It's like, okay, great, but you've reset the process. Do you understand that? You've reset the process. So now you have to start all over again from the premise of we have to build a functioning party. And that's a huge issue. You can't be revolutionary in character without having consistency, and you can't have it without support. You can't have it without, violent revolution or no, you can't do it without political clout. You can't do it without a plan. You can't do it without an approach, a method. And that's the biggest, and that's one of the idea of adventurism is I would say prolific among micro ideologies. They think that you could just, if you just started doing bold things tomorrow, you could win, and that's not how that's going to go. And individual acts of terrorism are not condoned by the party. I mean, we just look at how the fascists operate, and we can see all sorts of destructive behavior. I mean, we could talk about how fascism is a death cult as an ideology, or we could talk about, just the tendency in the United States to act violently upon the left. I mean, it's a dangerous situation. One should not act impulsively. And I worry that the biggest issue to obtaining left unity and any revolution of any kind is this idea that of individualism and adventurism, that you can just start doing things tomorrow as an individual and expect positive collective results. I don't see it happening like that. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm a Marxist. I'm a convinced Marxist-Leninist. If I keep saying the word institution, that's why. It's because that's what Lenin was trying to do and articulate, was institutions for class, not necessarily an institution for a political stripe. He was trying to create a political movement. I mean, it's really, to me, it's kind of axiomatic that you have to have a central compromised institution to a certain degree to make things work across a national instance or a national territory. I don't see it as something that you can really do at a small level of 10 people. It's just not going to happen.
Oh, yeah, totally agree. People always talk about this. We will do a revolution, and I am always wondering. Okay, I snap my fingers, and in 2 hours you are like you have control. How many of you are the president, the next new president of the world? How many people, viable people, apt people, educated with experience, do you have around you to put them in the proper position and have things going on instead of devolving into this self-destruction and anarchy and stuff like that? Because there is a slight chance of you doing a revolution, okay, and you took the power, okay, and how long until you lose that power and everyone else will start saying you are stupid? At best you are stupid and you don't know what you are doing and you don't have qualified people around you. So
right.
yeah.
And the worst part is like, we talk about issues of the 21st century, but this particular issue actually goes back to the 20th century. The fact that some people haven't learned, I mean, the Soviet Revolution, people will say it's dated, but I mean, just try to study the history of how the revolution proceeded. I mean, from start to finish, there were coups and counter coups and plots and conspiracies. If you start with a group of only 20 people and you're trying to, or a single institution, and you're trying to organize a government, let me tell you, there's plenty of Soviet history that tell you that's not going to go well for you. I mean, it's really bad. My favorite, sort of the overall trend of the Russian Revolution, and you can see this if you look carefully. What basically happens is that the Bolsheviks say, we are trying to do this. We are the Petrograd Soviet. We are the official government of Russia and, the former empire. And we are in charge. We have legitimacy. And we took down the bourgeois competitors. We're in charge. And then everyone goes, well, we're going to declare a government too. And they don't recognize that the Petrograd Soviet has had influence for decades. It went back to the revolution of 1905. It was not a new institution. And the people who were there were not new or young spring chickens. They were comrades with 20, 30 years of experience. And even if they weren't part of the party, they still had viable agendas, even if the agendas I don't agree with. But you look at some of the counter-revolutionary governments, they don't have to be necessarily reactionary. In fact, the trend over the Russian Revolution is that they became progressively more left, right? They're like, okay, let's try to consolidate the middle more towards the left so we could get more popular support from the last government that failed. And actually, the way the Russian Revolution ended was, or the Civil War, I should say, was that one of the admirals that was still commanding, I think, 10,000 soldiers, was actually arrested in transit to Vladivostok by one of the left SR Soviets, who just handed him over, who got them to surrender to them as a government, and who then immediately consolidated into the Soviet system. It's a political compromise.
Yeah.
And people forget about that. It's the way the war ended was a political shift to the left, and it kept doing that throughout the whole war.
Yeah, but that's the thing. People think about this. Either we cannot do about the extremes, and we must bring up in our discourse that hey, yes, those extremes it totally exists. Yes, the big corporations that control the internet, the Facebooks, Googles, Twitters, and so on, have an insanely huge amount of power at their disposal. But the other extreme and slash option is not you saying that you cannot do things, or is the same thing with taking power. Yeah, you should take power, or it's not necessary to say, hey, we don't have enough people to take power, and at the other end we must build like 1 million people and do a violent revolution. No, 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 those are extremes, and between them there is a logical, proper, constructive way of starting stuff and building things up and doing it in a way that you can build change without all this extreme nonsense flying around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I keep coming back to the scientific approach to socialism, but also collective work. I mean, it's hilarious how productive anarchists are with no central institutions because they collectivize their efforts. No one person is responsible for everything. And it's amusing when they start to say like, we can't have this position because it has too much power, man. That's always amusing. But the the institutions they do try to build don't necessarily have a sense of permanence. They just are participatory. And I think that's important to understand that when you need a workers' institution, it needs to be collective, and people need to actually be invested in what they're doing. They need to have a sense of ownership because that's what you're trying to do. Um, Lenin wrote 3 great essays on dual power. Go read them. He talked about before the revolution, during the revolution, and after revolution is actually when those essays were written. So they're pretty good timestamps on his ideas of dual power, and how it's built and what it is and what it does and what its purpose is. I think people often um, lose sight of the ideal that they want, and they focus too much on that, and they don't think about the political. They don't think about, okay, but you're going to have to convince 300 million Americans to have you as a government, or at least not try to overthrow you day one, and not be able to succeed day one if they decide
Yeah,
to do so. You know, it has to be a
yeah,
political solution.
yeah, totally agree. Okay, I say this is a good moment to wrap it up. Any last ideas? Promote yourself, links, Twitter, websites, and things like that.
Okay, so you can follow us on Twitter. I retweeted the comrades link at some point, and our press department should be retweeting that shortly soon. Individual members will be actually retweeting the thing you sent out. You can follow them. You can go to americancp.net or peoplesrev.net, and you can go.
Let me put that
Yeah,
up again.
yeah, and you
There
can
it is.
and you can check out the party. You can apply. You can support us. You can donate. We actually have a bookstore that'll be up shortly, where we will be publishing books on theory. You can eventually we'll also have a contact form you can send in, or if you just don't want to join the party but you have a question or you want to ask us questions. We also have a YouTube channel. We have an official YouTube channel. Just search People's Revolutionary Party official, or you can actually look. One of our members has a pretty popular YouTube channel called Danky Kang. That was the name he chose. And we also have an official podcast, the Crimson Flag podcast, which you can find on YouTube as well. Yeah, and on the YouTube channel, we release regular roundtables. Those are recorded in advance and released. We actually also just recently started a study circle. So because we have an party school, we have reading requirements, and so comrades get together to read a text and talk about it. And those videos are also released semi-weekly or bi-weekly. But yeah, we also have a Reddit page. I mean, you can find all of these links on our main page. They're in the top right-hand corner. We have an Instagram account. Follow us wherever you have a platform. And if you want to join the party, that's phenomenal. But if not, I'll hopefully see you out there and actually get a chance to work with you.
Oh, awesome. How did you enjoy the conversation?
I loved it. That was fun. These are the kind of conversations I like having as a general secretary.
Okay, awesome. So that was the conversation for today. Scott, thank you very much for coming on the show. People, you've heard him. Go to his website, their website, because it's an organization. Links to their social media. Go interact with them, talk with them, follow, subscribe, all those corporational things that you have to do in order to signal the same corporations that we exist. Pay the dues, so to say. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I'm Moff with Memories of the Future. I'll have more interesting contact, content. That's the word. I'll have more interesting content for you. We'll make a video about the housing in the Soviet Union, comparing them with the housing in the United States, and debunk some of the myths. I will talk about how to put it. What happens if you are a citizen from the former Soviet Union Eastern Bloc and you go out and you move to the capitalist world, and how that shifts your mindset, and what other things you might get into your vocabulary which weren't previously said. And those are very important nuances that one must be aware. And of course, we'll do the video on the better policing the police in a more constructive way. So stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and up till next time. Bye.